A very warm welcome to this webinar hosted today here at Responsibility, where we'll talk about why and how we should better manage the use of pesticides and how this related to climate change and how this could improve life in general. And I'm here today with Luis Corbett, which is our ESG specialist at Responsibility, and Aaron Kuhlenkamp, who is the lead for innovative finance at Nature Finance, which is an organization that engages with various stakeholders to leverage the role of finance in tackling those issues related to nature and climate crises, right? So for those who don't know, Responsibility is a leading asset manager that focuses on three core themes: financial inclusion, climate finance, and sustainable food, which is, of course, why we're here today. And just a note on the Q&A, we really welcome questions, so please feel free to use the Q&A section. And in the end, we will address the questions, and I will help for the help of my colleague Rachel to go through this. So let's start with you, Aaron. If we try to picture how climate shocks and food insecurity, that distress, increases the urgency to shift away from pesticide use and promote regenerative agriculture as we are about to surpass the 1.5-degree threshold. What would you say about that?
So, of course, we're confronting this poly crisis at the moment where escalating climate shocks combined with the collapse of ecosystems is putting increasing pressure on states and governments to dedicate resources towards adaptation and resilience. But at the same time, their shock absorption capacity is diminishing, their fiscal space is reduced, and so they simply do not have the resources. And so the use of pesticides is really an accelerant in this vicious cycle of increasing pressures on governments and diminished shock absorption capacity. And so what we need to do is to really find a way to arrest that. Regenerative agriculture is really one institutional lever and a resilience asset that has demonstrated that its ability to sort of halt this poly crisis or to contribute to its resolution. And a good example of this is work that we've done recently in Ghana, where, of course, as a major exporter of cocoa, they have a heavy reliance on nature. But the use of conventional agricultural practices combined with harmful pesticides over the years has led to really a dramatic decline in the output, the production of cocoa. And that, of course, has systemic effects for a country as reliant as it is on cocoa. So reduced exports means fewer inflows of foreign exchange, which they service their government debt, their sovereign debts. And that has contributed to what we saw recently, a sovereign debt crisis. Mm-hmm. And so without the ability to restore these natural capital assets, to replenish basically the stock of the nature and to be able to produce at the same level of output as they did before, we're going to see countries such as Ghana, which are at the forefront of this poly crisis, mm-hmm. trapped in this sovereign debt, nature, and climate vicious cycle. So, that is the urgency, that's the context, and the use of regenerative agriculture in general and more organic, more sort of nature-based pesticides is part of that story.
Thank you. Luis, maybe I hear harmful pesticides or things like, could you say a word of how do we know which pesticides are okay to use, which ones are harmful? And could you think of any cases where the use of harmful pesticides went wrong in our portfolio?
Yeah. Let me give some examples first. So what we have seen in environmental social due diligence is we recently looked at one where we saw a company that had incident relating to pesticides, and their employee who was trained in the use of pesticides was mixing up some pesticides, and they were required to wear a mask, which they did do. But the filters in the mask were old, So they'd been using it for a while, and unfortunately, this employee therefore inhaled the pesticides because the filters didn't work as they should, and they actually ended up in hospital. And that's just an indication of how highly hazardous that pesticide really is. And we've seen others where some untrained employees are called in to assist with the spraying of the pesticides when they really should have been trained, but they ended up with pesticide dripped on their body and through their clothing, and also ended up in hospital for a week, and then were out of work for weeks after that still. So, the people spraying and using this, if you're using highly hazardous pesticides, it can be real risks. I think what you were saying about some pesticides being dangerous and some being okay, how do we know? There actually are different classification systems out there. There's a few different versions, and they have different criteria. So the World Health Organization, for instance, is one that's commonly known, but they don't have as extensive criteria as some others. So for instance, they don't include fatal to inhale pesticides in their definition of a highly hazardous pesticide. So most of these classifications have a low, medium, high hazard. So the World Health, there's one, Lambda Sahelotron, always have these funny names. They class it as a moderate hazard pesticide, whereas another organization might class it as highly hazardous, because if you inhale it, it can injure you or you can die. So there's many different ways of classifying, and there's one NGO that's actually looked at the different classification systems and merged a lot of the criteria, and they've put this list out publicly. They're called Pesticide Action Network, PAN, and they have this list then that's easily available of what we call highly hazardous pesticides. So it's things linked to cancer or acute risks like breathing it in. So that's a nice way to check if it's highly hazardous versus something that's okay to use in your garden, like garlic or chili is like a natural pesticide that you could use, for instance. That's not highly hazardous.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I thought garlic examples really stick to my mind. Like, right.
Who knew the stinky garlic could keep your pests away?
And I think bear with me as I zoom out and zoom in with these two. Going back to Arendt, what are ways that society can actually guide allocation of capital to contribute to avoiding pesticides related risks?
Sure. So you really have to think about it in multiple levels, right? Almost like a stack of financing. Because these are large-scale transformations of food systems, you have to also think about large-scale mobilization and channeling of capital. So at the top level, it's things such as sustainability-linked debt. And this may be at the government level. There have already been some governments, very pioneering governments like Uruguay, that have borrowed at the government level, at the sovereign level, with a commitment to transition part of their agricultural base towards more sustainable practices. In this case, it was around their cattle industry and methane production, but conceivably you could have something similar around the use of pesticides and regenerative agriculture. So that is where you stimulate demand for these new types of practices, and you create incentives for producers at a large scale to shift their production. At the mid-level is where we build our markets, right? So you have to be able to give the producers the market signals in order to make those investments, right? Because ultimately, these are costly interventions for some. They have been working with the same sort of conventional practices, the use of insecticides and fungicides for many decades, many generations now. And so you really have to give them the right incentives. And so there are a number of different financing mechanisms that can facilitate that. Things such as impact loans, impact bonds, where of course responsibility has also been actively involved in bringing sort of this more impact invested and oriented capital to help spur that transition. And then at the lower level, it's about enabling supply. So working with producers, oftentimes this may be smallholder producers, to give them really the capacity to be able to undertake these changes. So that might involve training, the use of extension officers who work with the smallholder producers who really elucidate the harms that synthetic pesticides can cost and the advantages of shifting to more regenerative practices. So it's really an all-encompassing and coherent stack of solutions that needs to be deployed. And underpinning that, of course, is the enabling infrastructure. It's regulations, rules that try to discourage harmful practices and shift the incentives towards more regenerative pesticides and other practices.
Yeah, maybe Luis, could you give us or share with us how responsibility encourages our investees or the farmers or companies to reduce the use of pesticides?
Sure. Yeah, so we have a number of mechanisms we use to help our investees on their transition away from the use of highly hazardous pesticides. So we don't require them to be completely pesticide free. So typically we would use something called an environmental and social action plan, or an ESAP, and that is a contractual requirement that they have to comply with while we are invested. And that might say something like they need to reduce the use of highly hazardous pesticides or phase out specific ones, for instance. And then also in our contract with them, we would require that they allow us, someone like me, the ESG officer, to come and visit the site. So of course we can go and look at how they're using the pesticides and see what's in their chemical store, and are they actually using pesticides that are lower hazard. And we do also then have a monitoring requirement in terms of data monitoring. So we also follow up with them on if they are using pesticides, which ones are they using and how much. And that's so that we're able to actually see that they are transitioning away from highly hazardous pesticides. Maybe an interesting note there is that you might end up using more pesticides, but lower hazard, because they might not be quite as effective as the higher pesticides. So yeah, just something like it seems a contradiction, complex, but it's a complex issue.
And can you think of a successful story of how one of our investees did it well?
Well, we have some investees at the moment who were doing it well when we invested. There's others we're working with at the moment on the transition, but certainly we have an investee in Vietnam that uses, I think it's called the red-eyed wasp, which is a pest of the stem borer. The stem borer affects their crop, and so the wasp actually targets the pest that is bad for their crop, and they're using that instead of a chemical pesticide.
Okay,
so that's
very ingenious. Arendt, I often hear that, this sentence, we need to feed a growing population. How do you think this is relates to what we're talking today, and how do farmers can manage their practices in a better way? Do you think there's any contradiction in there?
I mean, there is a tension in the short run, precisely because we need to transition our food systems away from these conventional practices that may have been fit for purpose in the past. But in an increasingly climate-stressed future, we have to think more about resilience, perhaps less about yield in the short term, and more about the ability to withstand climate shocks. But what the evidence shows is that after they've transitioned to more regenerative practices, so it's not just the use of more sustainable types of pesticides, but also practices such as agroforestry, no-till farming, and the like, that actually yields do improve past the valley of death, as they call it, where you're investing, you're shifting practices, and that can cause some disruption. But on the other side of this, we do see lower costs, we do see higher returns, we do see improving yields. So in the medium to long term, I would say this potential tension between the need to produce food for the population and sort of the resilience and considerations around sustainability are in fact aligned. So it's about creating, again, those incentives, those structures that can give producers that comfort, that confidence that they will be rewarded for the actions that they're undertaking, and that might be painful in the medium and short term.
Yeah. And Luis, how do you think farmers, what can they do to onboard this transition? Is there any plan they could put in place on top of the...
So I think the best practice way to do that is it's called integrated pesticide management, and you have an integrated pesticide management plan. And that is a plan that helps you transition from using chemical pesticides to using alternative measures. A lot of it makes common sense. So farmers are, even conventional farmers are applying these things. So things such as using pest-resistant varieties of your crop, no-till or mulching, planting so that you miss the life cycle of the pests, so the plant is too big when the pest wants to eat it. Simple things like that. But yeah, obviously you might end up still needing to use chemical pesticides, but it helps you transition away from that.
Okay.
And we've actually seen a nice example in a potential investee that we're looking at where they've been doing exactly that. And they've indicated to us it's taken them a bit of time. So one of the things they've done that they said was very successful was simply for the use of fungicide. They've been monitoring the data, the weather data. And so if it's a wetter spring, then they spray. If it's drier, they don't spray, which basically before the conventional farmers around them are just spraying every year, irrespective of the weather. So I think they said that reduced, it was significant, it was sort of half the amount of fungicide used, obviously. And they are working on replacing the highly hazardous pesticides that they're using. But they have also indicated that it can be tricky because they indicated for the one that the pests are actually resistant to the lower hazard pesticides. And so it's taking them a bit of time to find an alternative there.
Yeah, it sounds like a nice way to combine technology, but still it sounds intuitive to check the weather.
Yes, it's so simple, but yeah, because a lot of farmers are just advised, you spray this when the crop is this size or the flowers are coming out or just before the crop blooms, you spray it. And that's what's happened, and it's not necessarily the best way of doing it. Yeah.
Maybe being conscious of time and giving the audience a chance to ask questions, I would maybe end with you, Arend. If we were to place ourselves because you mentioned the need of there are several levels of what needs to be changed, so to say. Where would you say we stand today, and what is needed so that we move or continue moving into the right direction?
Yeah, I think we do have a growing suite of instruments and interventions that we can deploy now to really start to accelerate, given the context, the shift towards more regenerative practices and to build these resilience assets. But the one that I find very compelling is actually regenerative school meals. And we've been doing some work in this space. So what this does is it creates a large market for producers to sort of incentivize them again to do this transition. And schools, of course, are large sources of demand. We're talking about potentially millions of children that need to be fed nutritious food. And so there's a shift in the way that people are thinking about school feeding programs by also focusing on the sourcing and the value chain underpinning those programs. So making sure that they are sustainably produced, locally produced, and finding ways to combine these two policy agendas into one. And so we are working on a number of different innovative financing structures that try to target both in the same sort of funding package with a set of key performance indicators and other mechanisms to support the production side, alongside with other indicators that encourage and incentivize the development of regenerative school meals. So, that I think is one of many different types of policy interventions. But of course, the market is also constantly innovating and coming up with good solutions for how to make it worthwhile for farmers to undertake this transition.
That's so nice. Yeah, it's a beautiful initiative. Yeah, that's really nice. Thank you so much for this very short discussion. Actually, I could stay here for hours. Maybe I will reach out to Rachel to see if there are any questions from the audience.
Sure. Hi, and thanks for enjoying the conversation. And I'd encourage other people who are on this call to add some questions. We've got a few, so let me first start with the really tricky problem, which is how do you see the pesticides that have been applied to a crop? So down the line, how do you track from a consumer point of view whether pesticides or highly hazardous pesticides have been used? This kind of like down the line problem. I wonder if you've got any experience or comments to
Yeah,
that.
maybe I'll try to answer that. I think it's a good question because for one of those initiatives to transition to a more sustainable agriculture is for us as consumers to support that. So how do we actually recognize what is sustainable? And I think that's really tricky because different countries have different requirements. So they might ban some highly hazardous pesticides, but the others are allowed. And in some cases, like in Europe, they've banned certain highly hazardous pesticides, but then they can import from countries where those are used. So a lot of pesticides banned in Europe, for instance, are used in emerging economies, Brazil, South Africa, for instance. So it's tricky because you can't actually know when you buy it, has it been used? The only way at the moment is to buy things that are certified. So if they organic, or I don't think there's a regen certification yet, but there are sort of, it's tricky because it's organic or not, or no certainty. So it's pretty hard. I mean, that's something I try myself, and it's pretty hard to do anything besides organic. And you try buy what you can, but obviously organic's more expensive, and I do feel there should be a middle line.
It's interesting, I never thought there's no regenerative agriculture label.
Yes.
So to say. Do you know?
Well, I mean, there are standards under development, but of course it is difficult precisely because production practices vary so much from country to country, from locality to locality, from crop to crop, and producer to producer. But I think what this raises, of course, as well, is the importance of having robust monitoring, reporting, verification during the production process. So making sure that the inputs can be tracked and verified, and as that creates an opportunity for funders and investors, of course, because they are investing against certain outcomes, and so that puts a premium on having good systems in place in order to be able to track these things. So there, I think we are seeing a big step change in the capabilities of being able to see what inputs are being used, verifying those, having quality control practices in place, and then you can sort of control the downstream effects by making sure that the inputs are safely secured. So yeah, I would say that that's an opportunity now, but of course there's also the importance of certification processes.
Yes.
We've got a couple more questions, so it'd be great to get to them. And one is, how do we get people to focus more on the long term, and where have you seen that work well? I think governments and consumers and even farmers really do see the long-term benefit of reducing pesticides, but they have a very short-term need to improve their yield. Where, without getting pessimistic, where have you seen a shift away from the short term?
I mean, I think we are seeing a lot of innovation happening around providing sort of that certainty that in the medium to long term, there's going to be demand for regeneratively produced outputs for products. And that involves some financial engineering. So we have examples of outcome bonds that are now being tested out in different contexts. There's an opportunity here to kind of lock in the commitment to offtake, to purchase product in the future, and this can extend out 5 to 10 years, and that can give them, the producers, the assurance that they will have a ready market with potentially a premium attached to it after this transition towards more regenerative practices. Of course, there are a number of countries that have these support programs in place, subsidies for the purchase of inputs, in this case, sustainable pesticides and other integrated pest management solutions. And so that can create, again, sort of these longer term incentives to make that transition. And then at the end of the day, it's also on consumers to opt for regeneratively produced outputs, products, which often might entail a premium. So we have to focus on both the supply and the demand side, and we're getting more and more creative about how to reconcile those two.
Thank you.
maybe a quick example there that Investia spoke about using the weather data. You know, they've been looking at this themselves. It's not something pushed on them, and pesticides cost a lot of money. So there is a reason for them to actually change and improve on that. And they also recognize that the soil health is a lot better if there's less pesticides. So it was better for, you know, then they could apply less fertilizer, for instance. And so it reduced other costs. So there was a short-term financial incentive to do that they recognized.
Very good. I think we have one more question on what's your take on the livestock perspective in a growing global population and a finite agricultural landscape? I mean, I guess we're getting a little off topic, but I guess there is a link between other types of pesticides and livestock. So do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, a bit off topic, as I say. You know, so I think I would recognize organic certification and produce often comes from smallholders in, you know, Africa, India, Brazil, South America, and often those smallholders do have livestock that they help, you know, and the dung is used as fertilizer. In that system, it is kind of necessary to help have the nutrients for the plants. On the other hand, there's also talk, I think we were talking yesterday, there's some controversy in Switzerland about cows eating grass that has been contaminated by pesticides, and whether they're able to sell the meat from the cows. And, you know, so there are other issues, and the feed from that the cows are actually eating, or the livestock, depending what livestock it is, but we are feeding them cereals and grains that are produced with these pesticides, and it's also going into the meat. So there's another side there of that. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah,
Right.
that's
so
all.
I think we,
Yep.
yes, we
Yes,
are
thank you.
right on time. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I invite you to follow Responsibility and Nature Finance if you want to be informed and follow what's going on the systemic level, but also on the investment side. And with that, I close our webinar for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Stella.
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks.